Hello students, in this video we are going to discuss Collins as the precursor of the Romantic movement in English literature. So, Collins was one of the poets who have been called the precursors of the Romantic revival. All his poetry was written about the middle of the 18th century and it consists in the seeds that flourished in the Romantic era. Collins' poetry is romantic in them, temper and style. Classical poetry of the 18th century belonged to the school of Pope. It was town poetry, poetry of the society, for example, Rape of the Lock. It was a satirical poetry showing upon the follies and the weakness of man and woman. Collins turned away from the town and bring us into a direct contact with nature. The ode on the passions glows with imaginations. Other poems exhibit genuine romantic spirit. We find in his poetry many of those qualities which we associate with romantic poetry: lyricism, subjectivity, melancholy, love of nature, and the interest in the past. And he discards the heroic couplet of classical poetry. Many critics, in their opinion, that believes that both Collins and Gray were minor poets of the second rank. They could not completely free themselves from classicalism and could not accept Romanticism wholeheartedly. Their attitude being half-hearted, fitful, and not true, especially in their early writing. The fact is that Colin was imbued with the true romantic spirit and temper. Even Johnson, who could never resist the temptation of criticizing the romantic reactionaries of his days, says of the Colin, he had employed his mind chiefly on subjects of fancy, and by indulging in some peculiar habits of thought, was eminently delighted with these flights of imagination, which passes the bounds of nature and to which the mind is reconciled only by the passive acquiescences of the popular traditions. He loves fairness, giants, and monsters. He delighted to rove through the meanders of enchantment, to gauge on the magnificence of golden palace of Rispo by the waterfall of Elysian Garden. He is, he is most himself in his odes, which bears unmistakable to impress Collins entirely. Collins' poetry was the first distinct utterance of the school which gave expression to the academic revolt against the canon accepted by the Pope in Wharton essay on the genius and writing of the Pope. Collins' odes are truly romantic in their theme, temper, and style. The most important feature of the Romantic reaction was the revival to the nature in natural manner. Side by side with this return to the nature was the revolt in both form and subject matter of the poetry. First point of view is romantic theme or the subject matter in the poetry of Colin. Colin brought English poetry out of the stuffy artificial atmosphere of the coffee houses into the open air life of the country, and his poetic utterances are closer to the common emotion forming the stuff of human life. He wrote on the subject of fancy and flights of imagination. His love of fairness, fairies, giants, and monster ghost stories found expression in his odes. Colin's poetry is not intellectual or satirical like the poetry of Pope. Lowell says the whole Romantic school, in its gem, no doubt, but yet unmistakably, lies in the ode on the popular superstitions of the Highland of Scotland. Here, in this ode, Colin let his imagination play over the myths and the legends about the creature of the fairy world. The passions grow with imagination. In the Ode to Evening, Colin portrays nature in the simple, direct, and fashionable manner. Next feature of being a essay, precursors of Romanticism, is the temperament which is popularly used by Collins in his poetry. He found in his odes and his elegy the outlet of native melancholy. He is deeply regretful of vanished beauty. Hence, his melancholy was nourished upon a yearning for the past. He longed for return to the beliefs of the older days, old legends, and the superstitions in the very middle of the so called age of reason. In the Ode to Evening, the choice of his poem shows the trend of his mind. In his passion, Collins shows preference for melancholy. Ode on the Death of, of the Thompson and Dickory in Imbaline are elegiac poem. Colin was the lover of nature, and his love for nature is revealed in each and every poem. Colin poetry is subjectivity. Colin describes himself in the manner of the romantic poet. His romantic style in the poetry was follows Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. The very first line of the ode to evening recall Lycidius, the folding star and the calm waters, remind us of Milton Comus. The eaves who slept in the birds recall their fairies of the midsummer night dreams. Though Colin could not completely avoid the use of artificial diction, yet his style has natural flow. It is not cold or intellectual, it is inspired by the feelings, fancy, and imagination. Colin began as a classicist and end as a romantic. His poetry his poetry prophesied the romantic age that was coming. He is fitly called the precursor of the romantic movement, for his poetry revealed many of the features of romanticism, such as freedom of imagination, interest in the past, love of nature, interest in supernaturalism, use of different kind of metaphorical forms, note of melancholy, influence of Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton, and last but not least, lyricism, melody, and music.